I'm Adrienne Montani. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming out on a rainy afternoon to talk about public education. I'm Adrienne Montani with First Call, BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition. And this is a topic very dear to our heart and to our coalition members, many of whom are here on our panel today. So thank you. We want to explore today and discuss the impacts of public education funding on some populations of students who we know very often rely on what the public education system has to offer to help them reach their full potential. And they also are the populations who will be most at risk if the public education, of not having their educational needs met if the public education system doesn't meet their needs or is underfunded. So some of the questions we'll be discussing tonight, they're in the back of your program as well, are how well these populations, different groups of students, are being served in today's public schools. Is there a difference? What's changed over time? Is there a difference between the supports that used to be there for some of these students and what's there today? And what would an ideal school support setting look like for some of these students to meet their educational needs? And of course, we are interested in the answers to these questions because we have a provincial election coming up in May. And how well our public schools are able to serve some of the most vulnerable learners is a topic of intense interest to ourselves, to our coalition partners, to parents, to learners themselves, to educators of all sorts, and all of us who value the right of a quality public education system or public schools for all children and youth, as was promised in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the right to a quality public education. Professor Paul Shaker, sitting here to my right, will be moderating our discussion today. Paul is a career educator who has served as a teacher educator, and dean in 5 of the United States, in the Mideast, and in Canada at Simon Fraser University, where he's a professor emeritus and former dean of education. Among his many initiatives, Paul hosts Your Education Matters, where this session will also be posted too. It's a topical video series on public education in BC. Joining us on our panel today are, again, I'm going to skip Alex, I'll come back to you, is Alana Hendren from Developmental Disabilities Association. She has worked as a leader in the field of intellectual disabilities for over 30 years. You'd never know it to look at her. She's the executive director of DDA, the Developmental Disabilities Association of Vancouver, Richmond. Thank you for being here, Alana. Dan Guinan from NEC Native Education College. He's an educator and president of the college in Vancouver. He has a master's in zoology and a doctorate in social sciences. As the college president, Dan serves on the Metro Vancouver Aboriginal Executive Council and the Board of Access and is currently the treasurer of both organizations. Dylan Falconer, after completing, I'll say his organization in a second. After completing a psychology degree at SFU, Dylan worked in group homes with young people, an alternate school as a school youth worker, and is now a program manager for PLEA Community Services Society, their U-Turn program supporting family caregivers to provide specialized placements for children and youth. Jason Chan from Success. Jason is a family and youth counselor and youth service coordinator with the Immigrant Settlement Agency Success and has over 30 years of experience working with youth and families. Carol White, down at the end there. Carol is executive director of the Downtown Eastside Neighborhood House. We were just discussing the small but mighty Downtown Eastside Neighborhood House, whose mission is to provide opportunities for residents to meaningfully engage with and contribute to their community in an equitable atmosphere of sharing and learning. She was previously a staff member at both Little Mountain and Mount Pleasant Neighborhood House. And Alex Hemingway. Alex's work for the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives focuses on the state of BC's public services, including education, healthcare, social services, and regulation. He also investigates the tax system and its relationship to inequality and the capacity of government to provide high quality and accessible public services. Before we get to the questions posed to our panelists, Alex is going to start us off by sharing some of his research on the state of public education funding in BC. So Alex, please come on. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to the panel, and I hope I can help set the stage with some of the big picture about the education funding situation across the province. As was mentioned, I'm from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We are Canada's leading progressive research institute, independent nonprofit, public policy institute. And if you find our work useful, if you find this presentation useful, you might want to follow us. And I have some information up here on this slide where you can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and you can sign up for our email list there at policyalternatives.ca/BC email. Looking at the overall situation we're facing in education funding in BC, I hear a lot of rhetoric that is eerily familiar to me today as I heard 15 years ago when I was graduating high school in Prince George. And at the time, this was, I think, the first big round of education funding cuts in this recent era in BC. And at the time, there was a striking parallel, because as we saw cuts unfolding in front of us, in Prince George, we saw 15 to 20 schools close in within a couple of years. It was quite extraordinary. At the same time, we heard that from the government that there were no cuts, that what was happening is that funding was being protected. And I think the echo of that we hear today is that as we've seen this past spring, funding crises at least half of the school districts around the province, not just here in Vancouver, as we've seen that reality unfold in front of us, as we've seen services stretched for kids with special needs, for example, we've heard from the government that funding is at record levels, which seems incongruent with the observed reality. So part of what I tried to do in a paper that we published at CCPA over the summer is take a look at those competing narratives and try and bring some numbers to bear to make sense of what we were hearing and what we were seeing. Now, what we've seen is, while we've heard the claims of record funding in the system, we've seen situations like parents being asked to fundraise more than ever for things as basic as playgrounds and classroom supplies. We see teachers asked to contribute out of their own pockets classroom supplies into the system. And we hear the claims of record levels of funding and the finger being pointed at local school boards for problems that we see in the system when it comes to issues like school closures or the overstretching of services. Most concerning of all, I think, over the past 15 years, we've seen class sizes grow substantially, and classrooms also hosting an increasing number of students with special learning needs and challenges with too few staff and resources available to support them. Now, all of this, looking at all of this, I think one important place to start in making sense of it is to ask, how much have we as a society, measured by our government's actions, prioritized public education in recent years? And could we afford a major reinvestment in the system if we want it? Now, arguably, the best way to understand what we can afford to invest in public education is to look at BC's overall economic pie and see how much of it we invest in the education system. And that's the figure I've got in front of you here shows that measured, and what we see is actually a significant drop in the share of our total economic pie dedicated to public education over the past 15 years. We've seen it fall from 3.3% of GDP in 2001 to a projected 2.5% from the budget 2016 numbers. That's a 25% decline. Now, you can measure this in a number of ways. The numbers I just read are from the blue line. If you look at the red line, that's looking at only operating grant funding as it's sent to local school districts. The trend is essentially the same. These are not small declines if you look at what they mean in dollar terms. So we're talking about a 0.8, 0.9% decline in the share of GDP dedicated to education. Now that represents about $2 billion per year that could be invested in the system if we return to those same levels of funding as 2001. Now, we often hear that enrollment has declined over that period, and that's true, although it is on the rise again across the province, projected to rise by about 40,000 students by 2024. But with that in mind, it's also useful to look at the funding going into the system on a per student basis. And in fact, if you look across Canada, BC has the second lowest per student funding in K-12 education in the country, about $1,000 below the national average, a statistic you may have heard before. Now, we've heard the government push back on some of these numbers, and I'm happy to come back to that in the Q&A if folks are interested. Not pushed back very effectively, in fact, if you look closely at the numbers. Now, with this in mind, when we see the lagging funding at a per student basis, and there's other series of numbers you can find in my report if you look at it online and you're interested in the details, but when we see this trend both as a share of our economy and compared to other provinces in the country on a per student basis, we wonder how can the government say that funding is at record levels? Well, in fairness, it's technically true, as it was in 2002, that the raw number of dollars going into education in BC has risen. The problem is that's not a very sensible metric. For example, I'm spending record levels of dollars on groceries, but I'm not eating more than I was last year or the year before. We understand that there is inflation to consider. The real question is whether spending is keeping up with, of course, the inflation rate, that should go without saying, but also, very importantly, a whole range of cost pressures that have been downloaded by the provincial government onto local school districts. Importantly, many of these costs are controlled directly by the provincial government, so it's not out of their hands. We're talking about the doubling of MSP premiums since 2001, 60% increase in BC Hydro rates since 2008, WorkSafe BC rates have gone up, the carbon tax, provincially mandated computer upgrades, and again, this is over and above the basic inflation rate, which we should also be accounting for. And of course, when costs are increased without enough compensating dollars flowing into our schools, the system is left under enormous pressure. Now, pinpointing the precise overall figure for these cost pressures is actually quite tricky. We do have an estimate I'm showing here that was quoted in internal government documents that pegs these cost pressures at least $192 million a year from the 2012 to 2014 school years. And to the extent that there is still contention and debate about whether there's sufficient funding in the system, one point that often gets missed is that even if you look at the legislature's own Select Standing Committee on Finance and Government Services, they themselves acknowledge that funding for K-12 education in the province is inadequate. And it's not a partisan committee of the opposition. Its majority of its members are from the governing party. In its recommendations, the committee states that additional funding is necessary to ensure the provision of quality public education and to properly meet the increased costs that schools are currently facing. So this shouldn't be in dispute. I think to some extent it still has been, but it should serve as a baseline for our understanding of the situation we're facing to recognize these realities. And by the way, I would just add, in addition to simply keeping up with cost pressures, and I think this will go to some of our discussion later, we don't want to just necessarily tread water and keep up with cost pressures. We also want to be able to consider new investments to enhance the overall quality of something as immensely important as our education system. Now, we know that public education is not just a nice to have in our province. It's actually an essential long-term investment, and we know it pays large social and economic dividends. We also know from the education research that investing resources in reducing class sizes substantially improves outcomes for students, and it has an equalizing effect by helping disadvantaged students in particular. And of course, we live in a province where we've seen persistent poverty, growing inequality, and education can be one of those great remaining equalizers, and all the more important for that reason. We also know that, as I've mentioned, and as I think we'll hear a lot more about, that kids with special needs and learning challenges are not getting the level of support that they need. Now, knowing that, I think just about everybody agrees that education is an important priority, but we're often told that we may like to invest more, but we simply can't. And as I outlined earlier, we really ought to understand that we can afford to reinvest in the system if we choose. There happens to be a large budget surplus in the province right now, but more importantly, if we look at the share of our economy dedicated to public education and think about returning to that to where it was 15 years ago, we'd have another $2 billion at hand. And that's a very large number. That may actually go beyond what's needed to reinvest in the system. But what it tells us is that that reinvestment is possible. It tells us what's in the realm of the possible. We do have room to work with here. And while we're primarily talking about education today, it's worth keeping in mind that this is not only an education story. We've seen these declines in funding in this sector as a share of our economy, but in fact, we've seen provincial public spending on the whole decline as a share of our economy over the past 15 years. In other words, we're seeing our public sphere shrink, and that's it's an education story, and it's one that goes beyond. And it's not an accident. This is a result of specific policies, for example, tax cuts that have primarily benefited the wealthiest British Columbians. In fact, if you look at households in the top 1% in BC, the top 1% now pays quite an extraordinary $41,000 less in tax per year than they did in 2001. These types of policies undermine our capacity to make critical investments in areas like education, but they're choices, and they've always been choices, and they can be changed, and that's really up to citizens in BC. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for laying some groundwork. And we're going to go around the table a few times and also give you a chance several times to input from the audience. We would like this to be a real dialogue, and as you know from the materials introducing the event, we have a little different spin on this session because we wanted it to, on the primary level, to be a dialogue among professionals. So you'll notice we haven't asked any parents as parents, for example, to speak today because not that we don't respect them, and some of these folks I'm sure are parents like I am, but we wanted to give the public another shot at the issues by hearing how professionals talk among themselves about these issues. We invited the public, but we want the dialogue to be pitched at the level of informed persons about education. There are parent groups now in Surrey, Richmond, and Vancouver, all that are holding meetings on this topic. You can get access to them on the web. The Vancouver organization is panvancouver.ca. We have videotaped at Your Education Matters the entire meeting that was held at Douglas Elementary recently where Alex spoke. And Alex's speech was also used in Surrey at the Surrey Schools parental meeting that was held in Surrey. So before we go to the panel, I just wanted to say to Alex and give him a chance to say a couple words that I did at the Surrey event get a chance to buttonhole former Minister of Education Fassbender, and he was dismissive of the data that you provided, and I'll go to two key points. That is the per capita spending from Stat Canada, and that is the ratio of GDP that's spent on education in the province now as opposed to in the past. So I don't want these points to slip unanswered away from us, Alex. So you can come here, you can pick up the mic, whichever you want. But there were about 5 MLAs at that meeting, and so it is on their agenda. And I noticed in today's paper that using the surplus for education was the second highest priority that a poll of BC voters revealed. So what do you, now that you've had your information out there for several months, and now that you've heard the government's response and that I've experienced it too personally, what do you have to say to that criticism?
Right, so there are 2 basic lines of criticism that you flagged, and they correspond pretty closely to these 2 graphs. So the first is the government, these numbers, the per student funding numbers compared across the country are from Statistics Canada. So that's pulled directly from Statistics Canada. The government has said there may be some issues with comparability of the data across provinces. And, you know, fair enough. The problem is the government has not shown its work. If you're going to say that we're right and Statistics Canada is wrong, you ought to be able to produce your work. So I think that's just a basic tenet of debate, public or academic or otherwise. Even if you take their numbers at their word, it moves Canada, it moves BC up a couple of notches on this comparative chart. And that's assuming that they've gotten everything right without showing their work. So putting that aside, the other piece is they've argued, actually straight away when my report came out, they were arguing to reporters in the media, and this was reported in the Tyee as well. We had a nice little back and forth with the Tyee reporter that the GDP numbers are not right in the report because there were some accounting changes in the way that public education funding was counted in BC over this period of time. Now, that's true. There were accounting changes. It just happens that those are changes that don't affect either of the series of data that I've got here. I sent the explainer back to the minister through the reporter, not to the spokesperson for the ministry through the reporter, and they essentially had no reply. Actually, what they said was, after receiving my reply, they said they would have to get an advanced copy of the report to be able to comment further, but this was after the report had already been publicly released and they had already commented on it to say it was wrong. So it didn't quite make sense at the time. So in any case, that particular line of argument really fell down quickly. And if folks are interested in some of the nitty-gritty on it, I'm happy to chat further about it.
Before you leave the microphone, does Stat Canada provide their work?
Well, actually, they at least have a published form of this data. They don't have a detailed breakdown of every aspect of their methodology, but the government claim I've only seen through the media so far. So, you know, that's both could be better. Yeah.
So Professor Sandra Matheson, my friend, is up front here, and this is educational psychologist talk, of which I'm not one, but I know my friend David Berliner would be here saying that if you don't provide your work, then we can't check it, and it might make a good speech, but it's not science.